Hello and welcome back to this AWS course. We're currently in section 4 and this is lesson 9. So where in lesson 8 we wrote code so we could upload images from our React UI to an Amazon S3 bucket. In this lesson we're going to do the reverse. We're going to put in some code that will get the images out of the S3 bucket and it'll return them to the React UI. Now, to understand the mechanism by which this works, I'll refer back to this diagram. You can find this diagram by Googling serverless S3 presigned URLs, and it's the first item on here. So the way this is going to work is that our React client is going to make a request to our API server, which is running inside a Lambda, and the request is essentially for all the files in the bucket. Later in the course we'll look at filtering them, but for now we'll just get everything. The API server, first of all, it'll go to the SDK and say, can you give me a list of all the items in the bucket? And it will get a list of all the file keys back. And once it's got those, it then iterates through the files and says for each one, please give me a signed URL. And the SDK will oblige, and eventually the Lambda will have amassed a list of signed URLs for every single item in the bucket, and it'll return that list to the client. And at that point the Lambda will exit and API server will stop running. But the client will still have this array of signed URLs, and each URL will give the client access to one file in the bucket. So it iterates through the list, and for each URL it goes and gets the data for that file out of the bucket and displays it on the screen. So eventually it will display every photo in the bucket on the screen. So if you'd like to see the source code for this, it is available. If you go to richerbraycourses.co.uk, you'll find that there is a repo for every section. So if you just visit this link on section 4, it'll take you to GitHub with the section 4 repo, and you'll find there's a folder for each lesson. So if you go to this lesson, lesson 9, this is the source code for this lesson. Okay, so here is that source code in Visual Studio Code, and I'll just walk you through it. I'm going to start at the back end, and if we look in app.ts, you'll see that there is now a new endpoint called /photos that the client's going to call to get a list of all those URLs, and it creates an S3 client object. It gets hold of the bucket name from the environment. We saw how that worked in an earlier lesson. We saw how the CDK creates the photos bucket, and then it creates the Lambda and it passes the name of the bucket into the Lambda in this environment variable. So the bucket name is available here. So once we've got a client set up and a bucket name, we can then make a call to the SDK asking for a list of all the items in this bucket. And it's an asynchronous call, so we await and eventually we'll get a response. And the response has a property called contents, which is essentially a list of all the items in the bucket, and we can iterate over that. So this S3 file is the iterator, and for each value we go off and call getSigned URL, and we pass in the bucket name and the key for that file. And we will get back in return a signed URL for this particular file, which will expire in 3,600 seconds, or we can change this to any number we like. So with that URL, we add it into this photo data array, not on its own, but as part of a JavaScript object. It's actually the small and large properties will contain the URL. And we then just keep iterating around this for loop until we have our photo data array full up with JavaScript objects, one for each file in the bucket. And then we just create an object called body that's going to be the body of data that's returned, and the object just contains the photo data array, and we return it using this JSON call, so it converts this object into a string. So that's the backend code. I have put a more advanced version available as well that uses what's called continuations, when you've got huge numbers of items in the bucket, and also concurrent asynchronous I/O, this promise.all call, which just speeds things up. But this is quite complex, and this is a slower version and will be perfectly okay for our needs. So one last thing before we move on to the front end, I'd just like to bring your attention to this get photos response type. It's defined in types.ts, and it basically says that the object we're returning has got a single property, photo data, and its type is a photo data array, and a photo data item has got these 5 properties. Now if we now move on to the front end, we'll see that the front end code also has a types.ts, and if I display that, we'll see the 2 files are identical. So the type of the data being sent by the back end is exactly the same as the type of the data being received by the front end. So I'll just put that over there for now, and we'll start off in the front end by looking at the call to the API server, which is here. So you can see we've added a new function here called list photos, and it's going to return a photo data array, albeit asynchronously by way of a promise. And the way it works is it calls our endpoint that we've just examined, and provided it gets an OK response, it parses the data that's returned back into an object, this body, which is of course of type getPhotosResponse, and then it extracts the photo data property from that and calls it photos array and returns that. So the important thing to note is the data being returned is of type photo data array. I'll just park this over there, and I'll now bring up the home page that actually consumes this data. Now, before we wrote this, the home page was just displaying a whole bunch of stock photos that were being imported from this over here. So let's have a quick look at this. And we can see the photos that were being exported were also of the type photo data array. And here's the first photo. You can see it's got an ID, a title, a description, and a small and a large URL. So the form of the data that was being displayed by the home page was exactly the same type as the form of the data that is being returned by our list photos. And that's going to make life very easy. So let's just have a quick look at the React function call for the home page. And we can see it's now got a useEffect, and this useEffect fires when the page is first loaded. And it calls load photos, which is this little internal function here. And load photos is just a mechanism for calling an asynchronous function, because we want to call list photos. So remember, list photos is this function over here. So it calls list photos asynchronously, and it waits, and eventually it'll get this photos array back, and it assigns it to bucket photos. Once this asynchronous call has completed, bucket photos will contain all of the images that are returned back from the server. So all we do is we inspect the length of bucket photos, and if it's non-zero we display this, otherwise we go ahead and display our regular photos, albeit filtered. Now there's no point in applying filters to our current photos because these don't have names or descriptions or anything, so we can come back and fix all this a little bit later. But for now, basically, if there are photos in the S3 bucket, they'll be displayed. Otherwise, our original hard-coded photos will be displayed. So I'll go ahead and do a pnpm install just to check everything's up to date. And then I'll run my alias prun. I'll say prun deploy everything. And that will essentially just take our new API server code and our new UI and upload them to AWS. So whilst that's running, I'm just going to come up here and go to the S3 bucket and have a look what's in it. And we can see it's completely empty at the moment. So when I first run the user interface, we should see our hard-coded photos. So this is nearly complete now. Okay, so let's find the CloudFront URL. Here it is. So if we open this, we should see our hard-coded images. So now if I upload a photo, just select this and upload it. Now if I go back to the home page, we should see that that's displayed instead. So that all appears to be working nicely. And with that, I will bring this lesson to a close, and I'll see you in the next.